Okay, I'm gonna be trying to show you guys how to wrangle the idea of global variables and using classes as tools. So the first thing I want to talk about is global variables. So if we make an int x equals 10, then this variable is accessible from any function we create here. So if I make another function, well, we need this one, of course, and then if I make a function f, which is a void function, and it literally just like sets x to be 0, right? So x equals 0. So the reason why people might say global state is bad is not because this situation is bad, but it can lead to worse situations. So the reason why this is bad, theoretically, is because you just keep adding more variables. So you have y, and then you have like z, right? And now in this function, you can like modify each one to be something else. And so this can start to become bad when you have more and more variables, like hundreds of variables, because this function, if I'm trying to scan, say there's a bug, I'm trying to figure out where the bug is. I look at this f, and if this function isn't very named very well, um, it might not be obvious like that this function is like modifying a variable that is causing the problem later on. So it's like finding the source of a bug becomes a lot harder when you don't know what a function has access to or like what it's modifying when a function is called. Um, so the reason why classes can help with this, and the reason why functions are kind of problematic is like, uh, so global variables are bad. What can we do? So the next step would be like, okay, I can just grab them, and then I can go into here, right? And then I go like this, and then now I can just like force it to take in those variables, so as reference or something. So this is like the first way of like kind of fixing this. But now like you have your variables defined in main, and now like any code in main kind of sees those variables. So that's like better, but not the best. And it's also like it's showing us that like if you make your variables get like killed after the function is over. So another example is like if we had a function like this, and I don't know, we have just a variable int a equals 1. Like if you try and like do stuff inside of a function, by the time you're at the end of the function, those variables get killed off. So you can't really do something like that. Um, Inside of a function. So you can't like try and reduce the scope of variables through a function because by the time you hit the bottom of the function, all of those variables are going to be like detonated. So it's not really like um, a great approach either. So this is where classes as tools kind of come in to like fix this for us. So globals are bad because as the code base scales, the variables can be modified from any place in the code. And the reason why that's bad is that if you're feeling a little bit lazy, then you might start modifying variables in places that aren't expected, and then you might run into more bugs later on because of that. So I'll show you why classes are good for this now. So if we just make a class, I'm just gonna call it like saver because it's dumb, and then we just have int xyz. I'll make this public, or let's make it private. Um, the reason why this is better technically, and then if we have like our function f inside of here, right? So the first benefit is that like, well, another thing that's kind of annoying is if we take this approach where we made our variables in main, every function that requires those variables has to be explicitly passed it. And if a function requires a lot of stuff, which is possible sometimes, then your function signatures can get really long, and that can also be annoying. So we kind of need to find a middle ground here. So if I just bring this into my class, the reason why this uh, is a little bit better is because now I can knock out this, right? So now it's able to operate on those variables, and those variables are now they're isolated to this class. Like they can't really be modified outside of like these two parentheses, which is nice because, well, it's a private. They're private. That's why. I can make this function public though, and then all we have to do is make a saver s, and then we can call s f. Um, so this is good. This can be good. Sometimes sometimes a function requires like a resource. Like these are technically resources, but sometimes resources are constructed outside of the class, because the resource is used by multiple different classes. So like, I just can make something called like a resource. So potentially like, let's like say we make like a sound resource, right? So if we have sound resource and like the saver requires it, but like, so this requires a resource, like the sound resource. But maybe there's a saver 2 class and it also requires a sound resource, right? So now it's like they both need that same resource. So we need to pass it in by like reference. It can't initialize it because they both need access to it. And so in that case, we need to have like a constructor for it, and it has to like take in the resource. So it has to be like something like this. And then we do like sound resource and then initialize it that way, and then define the function here. So this is good because we're passing in like what's required to the function, and then it has access. We would pass in like the resources that are required for the function to operate correctly, and maybe there's like a function that operates on the sound resource here. I don't know, like if there was a function, it would call that function. And now now like we can have a place where this state can be operated on within these functions, and it's like not visible outside of this class. So that's good. So we can pass in the sound resource. So this is another good way to like use classes, is with these resources. Now something I'll mention that you might not know is once you define a class attribute which is a reference, your class becomes non-copyable because you can't change the value of references. So just note that these are probably going to be like one-time classes that you like only instantiate once and don't really copy. You pass by reference. Anywhere else the saver is required, so just keep that in mind as well. But yeah, this is good. And now that I've kind of gone over the basics of that, I want to show you it in action in like a real project and how I utilize it to like have state that's not like crazy shared and kind of still be able to organize myself. Okay, so let's get to that. So I'm going to show you some code that I first had here, which is pretty nasty. But to be honest, this is kind of how code goes. Like at first it's bad and then it gets better. That's just the way of code. So what I was doing here was I'm creating a UI, and in that UI, I use something called the settings menu rect, right? So the settings menu rect gets created on line 249, and it gets used to make the UIs of a couple different UIs. So I have like the player settings UI. The player settings UI ends up using the main settings grid, and I think a lot of other UIs also use like the main settings rect got used there as well. So pretty much that variable that I created up here is being carried through below into all of this logic here. But you know, I want to make a function to create each UI. And so now if I were to use regular functions, that's good. But they would all have to have access to this to the settings menu rect, right? So that means it would either have to be passed in by argument to each function, which is a little bit annoying, or it could be global, which is bad for the reasons we talked about before, or we can make a class out of it, and I can show you what that looks like. So just kind of remember that it's like a bunch of code in a row and it's all using the same variable there. So instead what we do is we just like make the settings menu rect inside of a class here. And I can even make these things private probably, but whatever, it doesn't matter. The concept is what matters. And here I have my variable, and now it's like being used inside of each one of these functions. And the thing is, like, for the things that need to be passed in, it's still visible that they get passed in. So it's like this operates on the batcher, so if there's a problem with like the batching, then I still know that this class could be responsible for it. And it still allows me to like share variables throughout each thing. And yeah, these variables could be private because it's only used internally for that code, which makes it even better because the moment you make a private class variable, it reduces the number of lines where it can be accessed and modified. Yeah, that's all.